Have you ever paused and wondered if the path you've chosen is actually making your life harder? Maybe it's a question that whispers in the quiet moments, a soft doubt that creeps in between your breaths. This question often arises when someone begins to explore Buddhism. On the surface, Buddhist teachings might seem like a call to sacrifice, a demand for harsh discipline, or a withdrawal from life's simple joys. People see monks living austerely, hear about renunciation, and imagine a life filled with restrictions, where happiness is traded for struggle. It's easy to believe that practicing Buddhism means making life more difficult, that to follow the Buddha's path is to choose hardship over comfort, suffering over ease. But is that really true? The paradox lies here. While Buddhism invites us to confront suffering head-on, it does so not to deepen pain but to dissolve it. The path is challenging, yes, but the struggle itself is a gateway to profound freedom. It's a process that asks us to look beneath the surface of our everyday existence, to recognize the invisible burdens we carry, and to learn how to let go. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack, filled with worries, fears, regrets, and attachments. With every step you take, the weight grows heavier, but because it's been with you for so long, you hardly notice it anymore. Buddhist practice is like slowly unzipping that backpack, item by item, feeling the relief as each burden is lifted. It's not easy, letting go often stirs discomfort, but the relief, the lightness that follows is undeniable. Many who start this journey encounter resistance, from within and without. Internally, our minds resist change. We cling to habits and beliefs because they feel familiar and safe, even when they cause suffering. Externally, the world around us may not understand our new path. Friends might question our choices. Family may worry or feel disconnected. The social fabric that once supported our old ways can feel fragile or even unravel. Yet, it is precisely this tension that awakens us. The difficulty is not a punishment, but a mirror reflecting what we need to face. The practice teaches patience and courage. It encourages us to turn toward our fears instead of running away, to befriend our pain rather than deny it. In this exploration, we will gently peel back the layers of misunderstanding and fear that surround Buddhist practice. We'll examine how the journey inward, though sometimes uncomfortable, is a journey toward genuine peace. We'll look at the real challenges people face, not to scare you off, but to prepare and inspire you. Because at the heart of Buddhism is a promise that through mindful effort and compassionate understanding, life need not be a battle against suffering. Instead, it can become a dance with reality, raw, honest, and beautiful. So, if you've ever wondered whether practicing Buddhism makes life harder, this journey will offer a deeper perspective. One that invites you not just to endure life's hardships, but when someone mentions Buddhism, a flood of images and ideas often rush into our minds. Monks in orange robes, silent meditation retreats, renouncing the world, living a life of extreme austerity. For many, these images shape the first impression, and sometimes the only impression, of what practicing Buddhism truly means. One of the biggest misconceptions is that following Buddhism requires you to give up everything you love. Your family, your career, your pleasures. People imagine that you must live a life of strict rules, constant sacrifice, and endless self-denial. This idea, while partially rooted in historical monastic traditions, misses the fuller picture. Outside of monasteries, Buddhism is practiced by millions who live fully engaged lives, raising children, working jobs, enjoying music, food, and friendships. The essence of the practice is not about punishment or deprivation. It's about transformation, but that nuance is often lost in popular culture and social perception. This misunderstanding can create significant tension, especially from those closest to us. Friends and family might worry, "Why choose a path that seems so hard?" Or, "Are you rejecting us or your responsibilities?" Sometimes, these concerns stem from genuine care, but they can also feel like pressure or judgment. For someone beginning to walk the Buddhist path, this social pushback can be confusing, isolating, and emotionally taxing. In addition, there's a subtle but important distinction to make between authentic Buddhist practice and superstition. Buddhism is sometimes confused with rituals or beliefs that stray far from its original teachings. This can feed skepticism and make it harder for newcomers to separate genuine practice from cultural or magical thinking. The truth is, Buddhism encourages a mindful, intelligent approach to life. It invites questioning and personal experience over blind faith. It is a practice rooted in wisdom and compassion, not dogma or fear. But even with this understanding, society's images and stories about Buddhism often cling stubbornly to old stereotypes. The challenge for anyone who chooses this path is not just about their own inner work, but also about navigating these external misconceptions. And yet, this very challenge can become a profound teacher. It pushes us to develop patience, resilience, and deeper clarity about why we practice at all. It invites us to hold space for ourselves amid misunderstanding and to respond with kindness to others and to ourselves. So, while it might seem at first that practicing Buddhism makes life harder because of social pressures and misconceptions, in truth, it offers an opportunity to live authentically, to break free from limiting beliefs, and to cultivate a peace that knows beyond the external pressures and social misconceptions. The true test of Buddhist practice lies within. It's a journey that takes us deep into the landscape of our own minds, a place that is often far more complex and challenging than any external circumstance. At first glance, we might expect that following Buddhism would simply bring peace and calm, and in many ways it does. But before that peace emerges, there's a period of confrontation, a time when the shadows within us come alive. Our minds are filled with cravings, fears, anger, and countless stories we tell ourselves. These mental patterns are so familiar that we rarely notice them, like static noise in the background of our awareness. But Buddhist practice asks us to turn our attention directly toward this noise, to see it clearly, and to understand its nature. This can be uncomfortable. Facing our own mind means facing our deepest attachments, the desires that bind us to suffering. It means recognizing the anger we try to suppress, the jealousy we hide, the fear we pretend doesn't exist. It means meeting our own imperfections with honesty. It's like standing in front of a mirror that reflects not only our face but our inner struggles and wounds. The process can feel overwhelming. Sometimes it even feels like opening a door to a storm inside. But this storm is necessary. Without acknowledging the pain and confusion inside us, true transformation cannot occur. Like a gardener who must first clear weeds and rocks before planting new seeds, we must clear the mental obstacles that cloud our clarity and peace. Meditation and mindfulness are the tools that guide us through this inner terrain. Through sitting quietly and observing our thoughts without judgment, we begin to understand the transient nature of these mental states. We learn that cravings and aversions are not permanent truths, but passing clouds. This insight slowly chips away at the walls we've built around ourselves, walls made of fear and misunderstanding. We begin to see that these mental habits, though powerful, do not define who we are. We start to discover a space beneath the noise, a stillness that is always present, waiting to be recognized. This inner challenge is not a sign that the path is wrong or too difficult. On the contrary, it's a sign that the practice is working, that we are peeling away layers of illusion to find something more real and lasting. And as we learn to face our own mind with kindness and courage, the way forward becomes clearer. The difficult becomes the doorway. The struggle becomes the teacher. With this foundation, we prepare to explore how Buddhist practice is more than just a challenge. It is a transformative journey, a journey of growth and renewal, one that unfolds through discipline and wisdom. As we step deeper into the practice, the challenges we face begin to take on a new meaning. What once seemed like obstacles now reveal themselves as gateways, gateways to transformation, growth, and profound inner freedom. Buddhism is not about suffering for suffering's sake, nor is it about punishing the body or the mind. Instead, it is a path of disciplined effort, a commitment to daily practice that gradually reshapes our relationship with ourselves and the world. Discipline here doesn't mean harsh self-denial or rigid rules that strip away joy. Rather, it is a gentle but unwavering cultivation of habits that support clarity, compassion, and wisdom. It's the steady tending of a delicate garden, where every moment of mindfulness waters the roots of awakening. At the heart of this path lies the practice of the 5 precepts, guiding principles that encourage harmlessness, honesty, and respect. These aren't commandments to be obeyed out of fear, but voluntary commitments that create a foundation of ethical living. They free us from the chaos that comes from harmful actions and enable a clearer mind. Alongside ethical discipline is meditation, the art of training the mind. Meditation is often misunderstood as sitting silently with no thoughts, but it's much more. It's learning to watch the mind's restless nature without getting swept away. It's cultivating patience when distractions arise and compassion when difficult emotions surface. Through regular meditation, subtle shifts begin to happen. Impulses that once controlled us become clearer and less urgent. The grip of cravings loosens, the fire of anger cools, and beneath it all, a calm space opens, a sanctuary within that no external circumstance can touch. This disciplined practice is a slow but steady alchemy. It turns confusion into understanding, restlessness into peace, and self-centeredness into openness. It is a process of becoming, a gradual blossoming of the true nature that lies beneath the layers of habit and illusion. But discipline isn't always comfortable. There are moments when the mind resists, when old patterns reassert themselves with surprising strength. Sometimes, the effort feels exhausting or discouraging. These moments test our resolve and invite deeper patience. This is where the community, the Sangha, plays a crucial role. Practicing alongside others who share the path provides support, encouragement, and shared wisdom. The Sangha reminds us that we are not alone in our struggles, and that growth is often a collective journey as much as an individual one. Ultimately, discipline in Buddhism is not about perfection, but about persistence. It's about showing up again and again with an open heart and a curious mind. It's about trusting the process, even when the fruits are not immediately visible. Through this steady commitment, life begins to change in profound ways. The very challenges that once seemed unbearable become opportunities to cultivate strength, resilience, and clarity. And so, the path unfolds not as a punishment, but in today's fast-paced world, the idea of dedicating time to Buddhist practice can feel daunting. Between work, family, social obligations, and the endless stream of distractions, how can one find space for stillness and reflection? Many wonder, does embracing Buddhism mean retreating from daily life, or can it coexist with our responsibilities and ambitions? The answer lies in the heart of Buddhism itself, a path not of escape, but of engagement. Buddhism does not call us to withdraw from life. Rather, it teaches us how to be fully present in whatever life we live. This balance between practice and daily duties is one of the most profound challenges and gifts of the path. It requires skillful attention, intention, and sometimes creativity. It's not about perfection or rigid schedules, but about weaving mindfulness into the fabric of everyday moments. For some, this might mean starting the day with a few minutes of meditation, setting the tone of calm and clarity that carries forward. For others, it's about cultivating awareness during routine activities, washing dishes, walking, or even sitting in traffic. Each moment becomes an opportunity to return to presence, to reconnect with the breath, and to soften the mind. Buddhism encourages us to meet our responsibilities with an open heart. Whether it's parenting, working, or caring for others, these roles are seen not as distractions, but as grounds for practice. Patience when dealing with a difficult coworker, compassion for a tired child, or honesty in our interactions, all are expressions of the path in action. Yet this balance can feel fragile. There are days when life's pressures seem overwhelming, when the urge to retreat or give up practice feels strong. Here, the wisdom of the Buddhist tradition offers guidance. To treat ourselves with kindness, to acknowledge our limits without judgment, and to return gently to practice whenever possible. Technology, often seen as a barrier to mindfulness, can also become a tool. Apps for guided meditation, online communities, and teachings from modern Buddhist teachers make the path accessible even in busy lives. Ultimately, integrating Buddhism into modern life is a dynamic, evolving process. It asks us to be flexible, patient, and compassionate, especially toward ourselves. And as we cultivate this balance, we find that the challenges of daily life can transform from obstacles into teachers. Stress becomes a signal to pause and breathe. Frustration invites patience. Routine moments reveal their sacredness. Through this dance of practice and responsibility, life becomes richer and more meaningful. The path is not separate from our lives, it is our life, lived with awareness and heart. As we continue, we'll explore how the fruits of this balanced practice ripple outwards, affecting not only ourselves but the world around us, through the power of compassion. After navigating the challenges, misunderstandings, and disciplined effort of the Buddhist path, what lies at the end? What is the true reward that keeps practitioners motivated, especially when the journey feels difficult or the results aren't immediate? Buddhism teaches us that the greatest reward is not found in external achievements or fleeting pleasures. Instead, it reveals a deeper, more enduring freedom, a liberation that comes from within. This freedom is the release from the cycles of craving and aversion that trap us in suffering. It's the freedom to experience life as it truly is, without the distortions of fear, anger, or attachment. When the mind is freed from these chains, a profound peace arises, not the kind of peace dependent on conditions, but an unshakable calm that remains even amid life's inevitable ups and downs. This peace is closely linked to genuine happiness, a joy that is not dependent on external circumstances, possessions, or status. It's a happiness born of clarity and compassion, a radiant contentment that flows from living authentically and in harmony with the true nature of reality. Many who have walked the path describe moments of insight where the boundaries between self and other dissolve, where the heart expands with boundless kindness. These moments are glimpses of enlightenment, glimpses of the freedom that comes with seeing things as they really are. But this reward is not reserved for the enlightened alone. Even in small doses, moments of mindfulness and compassion can transform everyday life, bringing a richness and depth to simple experiences. The journey through difficulty, discipline, and balance is not without its struggles, but these are the very conditions that make the reward so precious. The more we cultivate patience, kindness, and understanding, the more we open ourselves to this lasting happiness. This reward also inspires a deeper commitment to the path. When we taste even a hint of this freedom and peace, it fuels our desire to continue practicing, not out of obligation, but from genuine joy. As this chapter closes, it's clear that the practice of Buddhism, far from making life harder, leads us toward as we reach the end of our exploration, it's time to return to the question that started it all. Does practicing Buddhism make life harder? The answer, like the path itself, is nuanced. On the surface, embracing Buddhism can seem challenging. It asks us to confront uncomfortable truths, to cultivate discipline, and to balance practice with life's demands. But beneath these challenges lies a profound invitation to transform difficulty into growth, to find freedom through facing our own minds, and to uncover a peace that no external circumstance can shake. Buddhism doesn't make life harder, it makes life real. It teaches us to meet life fully, with all its joys and sorrows, its light and shadows. And through that honest meeting, it opens the door to genuine happiness, compassion, and freedom. If this journey has sparked your curiosity or resonated with your experience, I invite you to join the conversation. Share your thoughts and questions in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective on how Buddhist practice has influenced your life, or any challenges you've faced along the way. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into Buddhist wisdom and stories that inspire growth and transformation. Together, we can explore this path and support each other on the journey toward a more mindful, compassionate